Here is a question that policymakers really don't want you to ask. If the screen of your Indian-made smartphone came from China, and the battery came from China, and the chipset was designed in California but fabricated in China, and the rare earth magnet in the speaker came from Chinese manufacturers, is it really made in India? India's trade deficit with China just hit a record 99.2 billion in a single year. That's roughly 8.3 lakh crore, more than India's entire defense budget multiplied by 3, flowing from India to China in 12 months. And yet, India has been officially trying to reduce its dependence on China since 2020. So, what's actually going on? That's what we will take a look in today's episode of Logistically Speaking. Why India simply cannot shut out Chinese money, Chinese components, or Chinese supply chains. In September 25, 2014, India's Prime Minister stood before a glittering audience in New Delhi and launched Make in India, a flagship initiative designed to transform India into a global manufacturing powerhouse. And the logo, a leaping lion made of industrial gears. The ambition to raise India's manufacturing share of GDP to 25% by 2025. The promise to create 100 million manufacturing jobs by 2022. A decade later, here is what the report card shows. Manufacturing share of India's GDP is 17.2% in 2025, actually lower than when the initiative was launched. India's share of global manufacturing export is mere 1.8%, and China, for comparison, produces 35% of all global manufactured goods. And the China dependence that Make in India was partially designed to address has gone in the opposite direction. The India-China trade deficit was 37.8 billion 10 years back, and by 24-25 it had exploded to 99.2 billion. In a single year, China's export to India reached 113.5 billion, while India's export to China were just 14.3 billion. China is India's largest trading partner, and not USA and not UAE, but it's China. Now, here is a critical question. Why hasn't Make in India worked as planned? The answer, bluntly put, is logistic and supply chain, and specifically the near impossibility of building world-class manufacturing without Chinese input, Chinese machinery, Chinese component, and increasingly Chinese investment. Let me trace how far the Chinese DNA run through some of the major Indian industries. Firstly, electronic and smartphone industry. India is now the world's second largest smartphone manufacturer. Quite impressive. But here is what actually means in supply chain terms. In financial year 24-25, electronics imports from China alone surged to dominate India's import basket. In March 2025 alone, electronics import from China jumped 25% to 9.7 billion in a single month. Laptops, 80.5% of India's laptops come from China, and flat panel displays, 86% from China. India assembles phone, China makes the parts. The difference between assembly and manufacturing is enormous, and India currently sits much closer to as an assembling country. Then the pharmaceutical industry. India is called the pharmacy of the world, the third largest drug producer globally, supplying 20% of global generic medicine. But let me tell you the dirty little secret of that story. India depends on China for 70 to 80% of its active pharmaceutical ingredients, or API, the raw material molecule that go into every medicine. In 2024, API import from China were valued at 2.3 billion. For essential medicines like ciprofloxacin and nitrofloxacin, used to treat everything from UTIs to anthrax, India has 100% dependency on Chinese supply. During COVID-19, when China briefly disrupted supply chain, Indian pharmaceutical factories faced genuine shortages of raw material. The pharmacy of the world was one Chinese supply disruption away from running out of medicine. Then comes the renewable industry. India has pledged to reach 500 gigawatt of renewable energy capacity by 2030. Bold target and admirable vision. But one problem. India imports most of its solar cells and modules from China. In financial year 2024, India's solar sector import hit $7 billion, of which 3.89 billion came from China alone. And it is the future of Indian mobility. EV battery cells are overwhelmingly sourced from China. China controls the global battery supply chain from raw material processing to finished battery pack assembly. Let's take rare earth mineral industry. This is one that keeps strategists up at night. Rare earth elements, 17 metals with the names like dysprosium, terbium, neodymium are the invisible ingredients inside every EV motor or every wind turbine, every smartphone speaker and every defense missile guidance system and every satellite. In financial year 24-25, India imported 57,000 tons of rare earth magnets. Of this, an overwhelming 93% came from China. And then in April 2025, China began restricting exports of rare earth elements and processing technologies, announcing export curves in phases through November and December 2025, covering 12 critical elements. And the result? Indian stockpiles of rare earth magnets lasted only 2 to 3 weeks post restrictions. India's EV sector, which had just crossed 2 million vehicles sold in 2024 for the first time, found itself staring into a supply cliff. I could go on, but I'm sure you get the picture. In June 2020, Indian and Chinese soldiers clashed in the Galwan Valley in the most deadly Himalayan border confrontation in 45 years. 20 Indian soldiers were killed. The mood in India turns rapidly from competitive rivalry to something closer to genuine hostility. The Indian government responded, and on April 17, 2020, the government issued Press Note 3, a regulatory intervention that fundamentally changed how Chinese money can flow into India. Before this, Chinese companies could invest in India through the automatic route. That is, no government approval needed, and just like investors from most other countries. But after Press Note 3, every single rupee of Chinese investment required prior government approval. Security clearances from the Ministry of Home Affairs and the ministry level scrutiny of every proposal. It also required the identification and approval of the Chinese beneficial owner, and beneficial ownership was capped at 10%. But once PN3 was implemented, Chinese FDI into India, already modest, effectively froze. Between April 2000 and March 2025, 25 years, total Chinese FDI into India was just 2.5 billion. That is 0.3% of India's total FDI inflow. China ranked 23rd among all Indian investors in India. To put this into perspective, Mauritius alone has invested 180 billion in India over the same period, 72 times more than China. By April 2024, the government had received 526 FDI approvals from Chinese investors. Of these, 124 were approved and 201 were rejected. The rest still pending in some cases for years. PN3 wasn't the only weapon. India also banned over 300 Chinese apps, including TikTok, WeChat, PUBG Mobile, and dozens of productivity tools, citing data privacy and national security. Chinese companies operating in India face raids, tax investigation, and regulatory scrutiny that competitors from other countries did not face. And then something unexpected happened. In July 2024, India's Chief Economic Advisor Anitha Nageshwaran made a remarkable public statement. India should actively encourage more FDI from China. It would help India boost its export sector. Then India's Finance Minister in her budget speech backed by the suggestion to simplify FDI norms to attract Chinese capital. India's Economic Survey 23-24 tabled in Parliament put it plainly. To boost Indian manufacturing and plug India into global supply chain, it is inevitable that India plugs itself into China's supply chain. Whether we do so by relying solely on imports or partially through Chinese investment is a choice that India has to make. The logistical reality explains why China is so hard to replace. China has invested in 40,000 kilometers of high-speed rail, more than the rest of the world combined. Its manufacturing clusters in Shenzhen, Guangzhou, Suzhou or Shanghai have entire ecosystem where a factory can source a component from a supplier literally across the street. And if any of the raw material or say a component is some 1,000 km away, it can be reached in 3 hours on the high-speed rail where the standard speed is 320 km per hour. China's port system already handles more than 160 million TEUs, with the direct sailing from major gateways like Shenzhen, Guangzhou and Shanghai reaching multiple Indian ports with a roughly 12 to 14 days time. Moving component and raw material to India is often both economical and time efficient compared to sourcing from distant Indian hinterland. By contrast, domestic cargo movement within India, whether from north to south or west to east, can take 7 to 10 days and cost significantly higher than sea movement, since Indian logistics is heavily dependent on trucking, which is costly and time consuming. In practical terms, it is sometimes genuinely faster and cheaper to source a component from Shenzhen or Shanghai than to move the same shipment from Chennai to Calcutta or maybe from Chennai to Delhi. Let me tell a part of the story that is almost never discussed openly. Chinese capital is already inside Indian economy and it just doesn't always arrive with a Chinese passport. When PN3 mandated government approval for Chinese FDI, the Chinese sophisticated investors found creative structures. Money originating in China started moving through intermediary jurisdictions of Mauritius, Singapore and Cayman Islands into Indian companies. Because the intermediate investor is Mauritius or Singapore entity, the Chinese beneficial ownership isn't always fully visible. During India's startup boom of 2016 to 2021, Chinese venture capital poured into Indian consumer technology at an extraordinary scale. When we analyze deeply, the scale is massive. Alibaba invested in Paytm, Big Basket, Zomato and Snapdeal. Tencent backed Baiju's, Hike, Messenger, Flipkart, Swiggy, Dream11 and Ola. Shunwei Capital, that is Xiaomi's founder Li Jun's fund, backed Indian startups across categories. And along with this, Hill House Capital and other China-linked funds had large India positions. At the peak of Chinese VC interest in India, roughly 18 of India's 30 unicorns had Chinese investors on their cap table. The government's FTA restrictions in 2020 targeted new Chinese investment, but the 8+ billion in Chinese VC money already inside Indian startups remained. Zomato listed on the Indian Stock Exchange with the Ant Group, that is Alibaba's fintech arm, as a major shareholder. Paytm went public with the Ant Group holding at significant stakes. And now, with the strategic context shifting again, the walls are quietly coming down. The cooperation and talks are on to recalibrate PN3 and reviewing how to selectively allow Chinese investment back in. Or in other words, geopolitical changes is directly translating into supply chain recalibration. You have heard the phrase China plus one. The idea that global companies are diversifying supply chain away from China, adding one more manufacturing base, often India or Vietnam, to reduce geopolitical risk. When Apple shipped iPhone assembly to India or when Nike shipped sneaker manufacturing to Vietnam, those factories still source most of their components from China. Vietnam itself imports enormous quantities of Chinese components to assemble goods and then export them as made in Vietnam. India's import from China are expected to increase by another 20% in the current fiscal year, even as India exports more manufactured goods globally. So, it's not China plus one. For most supply chain, it's currently China plus one assembler. The value creation, the components, the processing, the specialized manufacturing still flows through China. Only the final assembly shifts. Why is this so hard to change? There are 3 deep structural reasons. Let me talk on reason number 1, the ecosystem advantage. China has spent 30 years building integrated manufacturing clusters where every supplier in a product supply chain is within 50 kilometers of the assembly plant. Apple's supplier ecosystem in China means a component change can be implemented within 48 hours. In India, implementing the same change might take 2 to 3 months of lead time across dispersed suppliers. You cannot recreate this overnight. Reason number 2, the rare earth lock. China holds 38% of global proven rare earth reserves and possesses a far greater share of global supply. It has tightened export controls specifically on processing technologies, making it harder for other countries to build refining capabilities. Though India holds 6.9 million metric tons of its own rare earth reserve, we lack the processing infrastructure to utilize them. Building domestic refining takes 5 to 10 years of sustained investment. Reason number 3, the price gap.
Chinese manufacturing wages averaged $9 hour. Indian manufacturing wages are under $3 hour.
A significant advantage for India. But China's manufacturing productivity per worker is dramatically higher, and the logistic cost gap partially offset India's wage advantage. For high volume, precision goods, China cost competitiveness remains difficult. So where does this leave India? There are 3 distinct scenarios playing out simultaneously, and all 3 are actually happening right now. Scenario number 1, controlled engagement, that is, let Chinese capital in on Indian terms. This is a path that India's Economic Survey, Niti Aayog, and a growing chorus of economists are advocating. The argument is Chinese FDI in non-sensitive sectors like electronics manufacturing, solar, EVs, battery technology would create jobs, embed value addition in India, and reduce pure import dependence. At 26%, Chinese stake is permitted in Indian company, and Indian company can retain the majority control. The technology transfers and the supply chain value add stays in India. The government collect taxes and workers get jobs. Number 2, Atmanirbhar Bharat, that is, build it yourself, whatever it costs. This is the path of the National Critical Mineral Mission, launched in 24-25 with an outlay of 16,300 crore, that is targeting Indian owned rare earth reserve across Rajasthan, Kerala, Odisha, and Tamil Nadu to mine India's own rare earth deposit of 6.9 million metric ton. This path works, but it takes 10 to 15 years to build the ecosystem from scratch. And in the meantime, factories need to run, EVs need batteries, and phones need to be assembled. Number 3, geopolitical flux. The world changes the equation for India. US tariff has reduced on most Indian exports to around 18%, giving India a tariff edge over competitors like China, where US tariffs are still significantly higher. This realignment has made some Chinese export to the US less competitive, encouraging buyers to explore alternatives, including Indian suppliers. India's electronics and manufacturing sectors have benefited from this shift, contributing to the stronger export momentum. But even if the geopolitical environment forces more of the world to diversify away from China, India stands to gain only if it continues to invest in logistic infrastructure and the domestic component ecosystem, and of course the workforce training to absorb and scale that investment. You cannot wish away supply chains. The supply chain isn't just a trade relationship. It's a decade of investment in infrastructure, skills, logistic network, and regulatory framework. China built its supply chain dominance through 30 years of deliberate, patient, state-backed investment in manufacturing capability. India cannot build that in just 5 years or even 10 years through willpower alone. The choice facing India is not China or no China. That's a false binary, and the trade deficit numbers prove it every single month. So the real choice is import dependence or investment partnership. Buying Chinese goods keep Chinese factories running and Indian factories going empty. Allowing Chinese capital to Indian factories with the right governance and the right joint venture structures and the right technology transfer condition could all put India's workers to work, building things that reduce a very import dependency that is actually currently bleeding India's trade balance. Make in India is not dead. It's not a failure. It is an unfinished business, and the next chapter will be written by whether India can be honest about what it needs to complete the journey. So what do you think? Should India open its door to control Chinese investment or hold the line? Drop your arguments in the comments. We will be glad to hear from you. And Do not forget to subscribe, and this is the kind of analysis that mainstream media do not talk about always. Thank you and see you next.